3DMJers, welcome back to Anecdotes and Observation. That's AO, where I have my friend and colleague, Brian Miner, who I believe, the first time I met Brian Miner, the first time I became aware of the man who is Brian Miner must have been in around 2010 or 11. I want to say you were doing maybe your NGA pro debut with Berto, is that right?
Yeah, 2012 actually.
Okay.
Yeah, that was the first time, and I think we had talked about. I think that was right before you went to New Zealand too, so it was cool looking at some of the. We had sort of discussed some of your research before that. So that was it's been fun for sure.
Yeah, man. So, I think a lot of people in the 3DMJ audience know you as that dude in Colorado who trains with Berto, which is not untrue sometimes.
Not. It's not. Berto should be the one that trains with me.
Absolutely. That's what I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Everyone's moving here, and I always like to make it clear that I've been the one here the entire time. And just everyone just gathers around me.
You're allowing them
I've granted access.
Where you are.
Yeah.
You're
allowed them in my bubble.
That's right. So, to give our folks a little more context to who you are, can you give me a little more background as far as your career as both a coach and athlete, and also your academic background? Just for
I guess I own my own coaching company. Just BD Minor Coaching. Those are my initials. Nothing flashy there, but I am a raw powerlifter in the USAPL, 93 kilo weight class. I've done a meet as an 83. I've competed at the Arnold Pro Raw Challenge 3 times. Was fortunate enough to qualify. I've never been extremely competitive at that meet, but it's something I guess I'm proud of because it's getting harder and harder to get into that meet. So yeah, I would say a slightly above average powerlifter. And I'm also a natural pro bodybuilder. I won my pro card in 2012 working with Berto. And then I took 5 years off and competed this year with him at IPF Worlds or IPE Worlds.
Whatever it is now.
Yeah, whatever the acronym for the league is these days. So yeah, I've competed 3 times this year. And now I'm just taking this year more or less away from competing. I think I may do nationals, but just putting the focus more on, I think, coaching and, just focusing on the content side of things. But as far as education, my bachelor's degree, when I first went to school, I wanted to study health and exercise science, and I actually sort of got convinced out of it just because you can't really do much with a bachelor's in exercise science.
That's what they say.
That's what they say. But I ended up doing construction management actually, and I went to Colorado State University. It was they're a really big school for that program. So graduated in 2008, right when the economy went to hell, and
right when no one will construct.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I went from being a program that had 100% job placement to 20%. So that was just unfortunate timing. But what it did do is allow me to kind of rekindle my passion for things. And I went back, took some prerequisites, applied for grad school at CSU for health and exercise. And then I completed that in 2011. And then since then, I've been doing some coaching. I actually worked for 3 years in the construction management industry while just sort of establishing and bringing, getting my feet underneath me as a coach anyway. And then now I'm doing this full time. So it's been an unusual but fun ride for sure.
Yeah, I don't. And the funny thing is, I don't know that there is a usual for people who end up getting into bodybuilding and powerlifting coaching. I think.
No.
Yeah. All of us had a day job until we got our coaching business to a point where we didn't.
Yeah. Well, there's people that make that leap, but it's just a hard thing to do.
Yeah, they have Wi-Fi in their car for a while and live there. Yeah,
yeah, exactly.
Well, cool, man. So you've got an academic perspective from doing your master's You have a lot of personal and client experience, and you've recently started a blog, which we'll definitely link in the comments of this section. And you've asked some really cool questions that I found very stimulating. I think anyone who's been following me on Instagram, or even better, if you're following Brian on Instagram, you notice there was a quote from your first article, and correct me if I have it a little bit wrong, but paraphrasing it, it's that your ability to lift more weight is the outcome of progressive overload versus the cause of it.
Yeah. Yeah,
Which I think,
that was what it said. I don't know if it was worded that way, but yes, that's exactly
close
what
enough,
it said.
right?
Yeah, that's the point.
Which I think, would have rocked my socks just not that long ago, because it's something that, if those who have been following AO, that's like something I discussed in that first video. And I think, especially with and let me know your thoughts on this, especially as powerlifting and bodybuilding have gotten a little closer together, at least in kind of the drug-free, evidence-based little odd niche that we've sort of developed, sort of lived in. That might be something that would not be the baseline perspective of most people. So I think that was a really valuable blog. And what inspired you to write that, and where did that perspective come from for you?
Honestly, well, your first AO video, you kind of talked about progressive overload, and it sort of sparked my interest to dive a little bit deeper into it. Like, basically, the blog process for me, it's like I usually don't know my thoughts on the topic until I start writing it. It just helps me really refine my thought process on it. So, we know that we can grow with pretty much any intensity, and rep range. And I think I just wanted to understand mechanistically, like, why, and sort of theorize as to why that is. And we know, like, Schoenfeld had that paper in 2010, the mechanisms of muscle hypertrophy with, metabolic stress, mechanical tension, and muscle damage. And I think since then, there's been some proposed adjustments to that, or some proposed alternative explanations for some of that. And I know Menno Henselmans is one of those people that is kind of proposing that mechanical tension is the primary driver, and metabolic stress is more of a modulator and of that outcome, and that muscle damage is just kind of a byproduct of it all. So I think with it all being corollary to one another, I think it's hard to sort of tease out what is what. And I think we're still in the process of doing that. But for me, I think just writing that paper, one thing that I started to, or article, not paper, but one thing I started to kind of think about is, I think a lot of people associate the term mechanical tension with just heavier weight. And they just assume, mechanical tension is a driver. That means, like, the heavier you lift, the more load on the bar, the more tension. And I think, we know, based on the size principle, we recruit more muscle fibers. And so thinking about, as we fatigue to maintain the force output. And I think as we sort of look at the research, like, okay, well, if we're using such a light load with, a 30 rep set versus an 8 rep set, like, the mechanical tension per rep is less. But I think it really boils down to tension per fiber, like the amount of active fibers shouldering that load. Because if we have a light load with, only a handful of high threshold motor units, covering that, the tension per fiber can actually be significantly greater. And I don't know if that's something that's really been looked into or teased out completely. And I know Schoenfeld has a paper coming out soon, looking at the research regarding, like, muscle fiber type differences in hypertrophy across loading spectrum. So I think that'll provide a little bit more insight. But I think for me, it's, we know that the closer we are to failure, the more active recruitment we're going to have. But we also know that a lot of people associate EMG with activation. We know that a lot, like, heavy loads will have higher peak in average EMG ratings than like low loads. But one of the knocks on EMG is it doesn't really look at it. It's just like a snapshot into what's active at any given moment. And it doesn't account for potential like motor unit dropout or recycling. And I think that can sort of like, I guess my whole theory or where my mind went with this is sort of contingent on the idea that as you progressively push closer to failure with those higher rep sets, you're still getting a lot of mechanical tension, but it would almost be contingent on the fact that you're getting some like low threshold dropout in order for those higher threshold ones to have to cover the slack on that. And I don't know if that's exactly true. I just think it's interesting. And I think there's, the alternative explanation could just be that there's, varying types of muscle fiber hypertrophy between loading spectrums. So yeah, I guess that was kind of a long-winded answer, but it was more just me just kind of nerding out, trying to answer the question in my own head. I know, you and I talked a little bit throughout that process. And at one point I was sort of thinking like, okay, well, if load progression isn't necessary, then why is performance really important? And I think, ultimately it's just in order for us to be able to recruit that full pool of muscle fibers. And that's also a hypothesis. But I think like for progressive overload, it sort of distills down to like, if we just chase, like say we could fully recover to the point where we're getting, we're recovering our ability to produce force, is progressive overload simply being achieved by just pushing to a high enough relative intensity per set? Like, does it really need to get any more complicated than that? And I think that sort of explains like what I see in the gym, with people that are less, following less evidence-based approaches that still aren't hurting for development, but they're just, pushing really hard. It's like they're checking that box in just a different manner. They're accruing high levels of tension because they're pushing to high relative intensity versus pushing the weight up necessarily. So yeah, there's a lot of downstream implications of that, but it's, and I don't know if I'm completely right. I think it's something that still needs to be answered, but I think that for me, that idea answers a lot of potential questions.
Yeah, man. I mean, there's a lot to tackle in that. So I think the big one to start with is that I think most people, when they think of a high rep set, their first thought, if they're kind of engaged with the literature, would be, oh, that works due to metabolic stress. Mm-hmm. But it's a really, really interesting point that it might just be working for the exact same mechanism as heavy loads. It's just that accrual of tension occurs over the length of the set versus immediately, and then you get as much you can before you can no longer move that external load.
Right.
And I think that is correct, just based on what we know about force transmission. I know one thing that blew my mind when I was coming up in my master's was there was a picture that they showed us of a muscle that they'd burned out all of the actual fiber tissue, but left all the intra and extracellular matrix. So you can see all the stuff that creates connection. And it's this crazy cool, like 3D spiderweb thing. And then when you start to learn about like costomeres and like lateral transmission of force and how like a highly efficient level of force is transferred from one fiber to all the surrounding fibers, then you start to realize, oh man, like when you lift, sure, we know that certain fibers are active and certain ones aren't, but there's a pretty effective force transmission. And then when we think about, okay, well, what is causing failure? It's when fibers can no longer produce force. So something else has to be coming in there to keep it going. It's maybe that it's not in a clear sequence like it would be with something heavy. So yeah, I would say that's pretty much, we just know that's probably the way a muscle works, and that if you are doing a high rep set to failure, that eventually you're recruiting everything. But then the question becomes, and I think you started to get to this, is recruitment and failure aren't necessarily the same thing as recruitment and getting a training effect for everything at a fiber level, right? All we know is that the final output of can I do another rep is no, but we don't know how much could get, like maybe you cycled in some high threshold motor units at the end, and this is their first time coming up, but everything else is so fatigued that they weren't enough to actually get another rep.
Right.
So does that high threshold motor unit and its associated fast twitch fibers, did they get trained from that high rep set?
Yeah.
And I think that's what we don't know yet. But so yeah, so then let me ask you that question. Where are you at right now with your theoretical, hypothetical thoughts on is there a difference in fiber type growth from doing high rep sets to failure versus an equivalent total like impulse? We'll say that, which I'm saying volume, but being more specific than say a low rep, high load set.
I don't know. I'm not convinced either way. I like to think I do. The first time I had heard of impulse, you had actually talked about a study that looked at impulse based off of rest intervals, or I think it was maybe tempo. And that was like an interesting concept for me, because I think if there was one sort of corollary factor to hypertrophy more than anything, maybe it is impulse, because it's accounting for the magnitude and the time that you're exposed to that. So I sort of think of impulse as on the per fiber level, rather than the set as a whole.
Which is by the way, I think that's a really cool take on it, because it helps to really kind of embed that concept in what we think probably causes hypertrophy. And just for anyone listening who's going like, what the fuck is impulse? Like, I watched Star Trek, but it's been a while. So impulse is simply a physics calculation of force times time. And you have probably actually thought about this more intuitively just from your bro exposure, like we've all had. Like, people talk about time under tension, which is the total length of time you're contracting. And it's just also paying attention to the magnitude of that contraction. So, and you can also intuitively realize that matters, because we are always, like, if we're moving, we're contracting. And we know walking is a super high time, but very low contraction. That doesn't result in growth after you're, not sedentary. So anyway, it's kind of the combined factors of the total magnitude of tension, if we're talking about on the per fiber level, and also the time spent doing that contraction. So carry on.
Yeah. So I think when you look at, like, Schoenfeld's had two papers that have sort of teased out the idea that it's not just about recruitment. Like, we know, I think they compared the first paper that I'm thinking of, compared, I think, 2 to 4 RM versus 8 to 12, equated for the number. Both. Yeah. So the volume was certainly greater in the 3 sets of 8 to 12, if you're going by tonnage. But if you're going by number of sets, then like your total volume, I guess, is sort of equated. It just depends on how you're defining volume. But the 8 to 12 showed greater increase in hypertrophy. And we know that, training to failure, and even that the absolute loads that 2 to 4 rep max would require, we're probably getting full fiber recruitment with every rep in those sets as well. So I think it's not like, even though we're still recruiting the full spectrum in both of those scenarios, I think one thing that I would hypothesize or be curious to find out is that 8 to 12 resulting in just a greater degree of type 1 or like low threshold hypertrophy, because you're affording that as the set goes on, you're getting a training effect that's per fiber on those slow twitch before where you're forced to recruit those higher threshold motor units. And I think that's plausible. But then I think he has another study, 8 to 12 versus the 25 to 35. And those were equivalent as well. So there's probably like that sweet spot, which non-coincidentally, I mean, I think just through anecdote, people kind of have gravitated towards that moderate rep range. And I don't think that's by coincidence.
So that's interesting, because that results in different ways of potentially tracking volume depending on the repetition zone you're training in, right? So that would mean that, hey, once you're doing, let's say, the 6 to 8 rep range or higher. So 6+, you might be able to just count sets. Like it is that, because at the 6 rep mark, you're recruiting everything, but you're doing as many possible reps you can while recruiting everything. But you're right at that threshold of where maybe if you're going a little lighter, you'd have to get a few more reps in.
Yeah.
And it's almost this kind of long elongated bell curve where a set of 20 or a set of 6 would actually in the end result in that same net impulse or close enough if you take both sets to failure.
Yeah.
Which is a super interesting concept, and I think it makes sense, and it certainly, like, I don't know that that's true, but it certainly seems like when you look at all the studies out there where you match sets, that's what happens in terms of aggregate hypertrophy.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah, and that's sort of how, when I program, like conveniently it just kind of works out. I used to use tonnage as more of a metric to, I used to put more stock in it than I do now. Like I put very minimal stock in it now.
Yeah.
Just because it doesn't tell us anything about the quality of that volume. By quality, I just simply mean the recruitment aspect.
It's also got problems if you're working across people.
Exactly.
Because you take a 48 kilo female or you take a 120 kilo male, and they could be doing the exact same number of reps at the exact same percentage of 1RM, but the tonnage may be 3 times in the 120 just because he's stronger, if it's sets rep times load. Then I think we've then progressed to maybe we should look at relative volume, where that absolute load is instead of a percentage 1RM, which I think is okay. But even then, like you said, it lumps it all together and you lose some of that understanding of that quality of volume and magnitude.
And I guess one thing I wanted to mention and kind of give credit where it's due, the first time I had really been exposed to that idea, like matching hard sets, was an article on Greg's website, Greg Knuckles' website. And I want to say his name's Nathan Jones. I could be wrong there, but it was a guest article written for Greg. And I remember at the time, it almost kind of like rubbed me the wrong way. I'm like, no, like tonnage matters. But like the more I started dissecting it, I'm like, wait, like, fuck, maybe it doesn't matter that much. I mean, it's not telling us what we actually want it to be telling us, or we want to believe it's telling us. But I know, and I haven't read that article in a while, but I know at the end, I think Greg or Nate gave some recommendations on, number of sets within different rep ranges, which I think is the correct way to think of it. I don't think every rep range is created equal when you match number of sets, and that's been shown in that study with Schoenfeld with the 2 to 4 versus 8 to 12. So yeah, I think anything over like that 8-ish rep range, like as long as, and that's also assuming you're pushing them both to the same, high relative intensity. I think you're probably getting very similar outcomes in terms of overall hypertrophy.
Aggregate,
Yeah, and I'm not sure. Yeah, I agree. I'm not sure if there's differences between type 1 and type 2 on that. And I think there's mixed research on that to the point where it's just inconclusive at this stage.
I would agree with that. Today, Greg's article, the Stronger by Science article, rubbed me the wrong way too, because I had come from the muscle and strength pyramids perspective, where I had the number of reps that I was using, which is just based off of the fact that we didn't yet have a meta-analysis on sets per week. We had Krieger's sets per session 1, and then we had the Wernbaum systematic review that looked at just that kind of raw percentage gain bell curve. It was basically like an unfiltered meta-analysis, if you will, if anyone wants to get geeky with the stats. They just purely looked at how many reps they do, and then where was the most percentage gains in muscle mass, which is, it's not that bad actually. No. But it doesn't account for things like heterogeneity of the data, or one study being like weighting things too much, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, so I think I had that same initial reaction, and then I thought about it. I was like, well, reps per set probably would matter if we're talking about heavy ass loads, because like you said, if that 3x3 doesn't compare to that 3x10, why? And okay, that's because each one of those reps in the 3x3 is maybe close to like maximal hypertrophy stimulus. or at least higher.
Yeah.
But it's just not enough. So it might make sense to count each unit of repetitions when you're talking about like 6 RM loads and heavier, which muddies the water further, for sure. But interestingly enough, we've got that other recent meta-analysis looking at number of sets per week for strength, and it kind of with a similar dose response curve to the 1 to 5, 5 to 9, 10 plus that we saw in Schoenfeld's beta. So it's almost like when you're not looking at hypertrophy and you're looking at skill development, it tends to wash out again with the number of sets, because I would say a heavy triple, each one of those is almost specific enough to a max single that you're going to test. But the closer you get to a single, the more it counts. So it's like almost like you compare a heavy triple to a heavy 4, and they'd be more or less the same thing.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Which is interesting.
Yeah. I think those higher rep sets, if anything, it's like, I think maybe you're getting similar type 1 or type 2 hypertrophy between the low and the high, because say everything above a 7 RPE, just for simplicity, is like full spectrum recruitment. I mean, we're basically going to be there for every rep in that low rep set, and then we're going to be there for 2/3 of the way through the set on that higher rep set. But what about all of, like, I guess one beef I kind of have with the term effective reps is I think everything below that is still contributing or potentially contributing to like slow twitch development.
It's a heuristic. It's not actually true. And I think that's a good thing to point out. It's a continuum, basically.
Mm-hmm.
You would think that the effectiveness of a 20 rep set is not like nothing until you've done 12, and then all of a sudden the last 8 reps do something.
Yeah.
It's not that. It's basically this probably relatively even slope of effectiveness as you get closer to the 20th rep. And I would say it even extends all the way to 20, even though we're talking about an RPE 7. It's just that doing those last 3 reps might cause other problems in the rest of the workout or the week. So would you agree with that?
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this, because I don't know. I think there might be something I'm not convinced on here. So would you say you're doing a set of 10 up to a 10 RPE, and you were looking on like the hypertrophic stimulus on a rep by rep basis. Are you saying you think maybe like rep 10 has a higher stimulus than rep 8? Or do you think it's just 2 more reps of that same stimulus?
That's a good question. Does it plateau and stay high? So you're just getting more max volume, or is it actually higher?
I think it plateaus. Well, my thought is it probably plateaus, and it's just you're getting more volume under that fully recruited state.
I would say yes, if somehow in a magical world the velocity of the rep 8 and rep 10 were the same, but they're not.
Yeah,
that's the thing. It's going to take you, that 10th rep is going to, like, our body doesn't actually count reps. Our body counts the magnitude of tension. And if that 10th rep is a 4-second rep, but your 8th one's a 3-second rep, then theoretically, if you're looking at just a rep, it's a little more time exposed to that level of tension.
Yeah. I'm glad we did this, because I hadn't thought of that yet. And that's something kind of obvious that I hadn't even thought of. So I think that's a good point. I think that's a really good point.
It's hard for that to be obvious, because you have to think about this stuff. You have to dictate some organizing principles the way your brain works. So we think about reps, we think about sets, we think about tonnage, and then we forget that reps are actually just some arbitrary counting system. So and it's tough. So I do technically think, if we're going to categorize it by reps, that you would see this increasing stimulus level the further you go, because the hardest rep to complete is also the rep that takes the longest to complete, and it should be still at that same, like, I would say recruitment plateaus, but stimulus doesn't, if that makes sense.
No, yes, that makes sense. I agree with you.
Cool.
I hadn't even thought of the velocity aspect, but it's, I'm sure it's somewhat minute. They're all going to be pretty slow, but I think, like, if you were to be, as precise as possible. Yeah, I could definitely see that. That makes sense.
Yeah, man.
That was good.
Yeah. So you mentioned something that I don't know if I agree with, that perhaps for the slow twitch fibers, it's the same. And maybe I'm misrepresenting what you said, whether you're doing like a moderate or a high rep set in terms of their stimulus, because I don't know. Well, go ahead, talk more
Well,
about
no,
that.
I was just going to say, I think that's probably where the disparity between like the 8 to 12 and the 2 to 4 come into play. Because you're
Yep.
still getting the same amount of reps at full recruitment in both scenarios. It's like you're still
Mhm.
getting, say, 3 reps at 100% recruitment in both scenarios, which is, it's impossible to know for sure because we don't know, like, the magnitude of tension per slow twitch fiber is going to be greater in the 2 to 4 as well. So that aspect, I guess that's my hypothesis, and I'm not sure it's
Yeah.
been teased out yet.
Yeah. So my thoughts there are that, okay, if these slow twitch fibers are, even when they're producing max force, they are slower to fatigue, I would think they're also then slower to get a training effect. So it may be that in a 3RM, yeah, immediately every slow twitch fiber is recruited and it is exerting force. But by the time that set concludes, they haven't received a training effect, while those high threshold fast twitch fibers have.
That, I
And
guess
maybe that
that's,
is why you would
yeah.
get, which I think is very plausible.